If you catch them at the station.
Infernal by Phideaux. I can't believe I'm actually reviewing it. Yay! So Phideaux is a multi-instrumental artist. He's one of those few artists within the progressive rock community that kind of encompasses both ideologies of what I consider to be progressive rock, and that he uses a lot of those boundary-pushing techniques that were kind of uncovered in the 70s while also pushing the music forward, and it's really hard to kind of do both. Now, with Infernal, I need to give a little bit of a history lesson within how we got here and how it came to be so long in waiting for this particular album, because we've been waiting for this album for 11 years, and I'm going to give a little bit of context into why. So, back in 2006, Phideaux had released The Great Leap, and The Great Leap is the first of a 3-part album trilogy. All the albums up to that point had kind of put him on a gothic, dark, progressive rock kind of a tinge. Now, when he released Doomsday Afternoon in 2007, this was part 2 of the 3-part trilogy, and this took a dive into a deeper progressive rock and experimental approach. This is where we had very longer and complex movements of music. We had themes that were reprising themselves. This, in my mind, is one of the absolute masterpieces. I've already reviewed it pretty much in length, and so whenever I go to rank an album or rate an album, I always kind of put it on the scale and see if it balances, and if it balances, then I'll give it the masterpiece status, and Doomsday Afternoon is one of those equalizer albums that I'll put on the scale to see if it balances. Now, after Doomsday Afternoon, Phideaux had announced Infernal was going to comprise of 2 pieces, Eternal and Infernal, and he didn't feel confident enough to really write what he had in his head for what he wanted it to be. He had 2 pieces of full-length music that he wanted to put down. One was Waiting for the Axe to Fall, and the other one was this mythical Snow Torch. Waiting for the Axe to Fall finds itself on number 7 as it grew into this larger piece of music, and this also allowed him to stretch his legs and develop more of the skills that he was hoping for Infernal. He took this mythical Snow Torch song that he wrote and really blossomed it out and really explored the territory to the point where it became a full-length album. So Snow Torch, very much like, say, Jethro Tull's Thick as a Brick or Passion Play, is a single piece that's on a full-length album. After Snow Torch was dropped, Phideaux kind of disappeared after a while. He kept hinting every once in a while of what Infernal was going to be, and back in 2012, 2013, he had the track lengths of how Infernal had grown from a single disc with the 2 tracks to a double album with 4 interconnecting tracks. Phideaux had kind of left us informed enough to be like, okay, we laid down this, we laid down that, we're experimenting with this, we're experimenting with that, but it never really kind of came to fruition of when we were to expect Infernal. Earlier on this year, we finally heard that Infernal was ready, everything had been recorded, everything was being mixed, and by July, we could expect to hear it, and I was just stoked. We Only Have Eyes for You, the EP that was set to kind of help ramp up the hype train, finally was released. I loved it. I was so stoked to hear what to be found on this album. So that's where we are now, and that's why I was able to get this review out. This album will be released in September. All systems are go. I've already got my pre-release order in for the LP. So, with all that historical context, it goes without saying that Infernal had a lot to live up to. We have 11 years wait for this album, and a lot of albums that follow this kind of a waiting cycle, it always kind of disappoints. Whenever we as a fan base have to wait an extended period of time for this album that's been in the works for so long, we start to get a little bit antsy and the expectations rise a little bit more because we've had so much time to sit with this and to think about what it's going to sound like. Very rarely does the grandiosity of our expectations are ever met. Now that is also paired with a twofold factor. The first factor is all the albums that came before this have just been increasing in level of complexity and in a masterpiece status. And I'm going from Doomsday Afternoon to number 7 to Snow Torch. Each of these albums, for me, it felt like it raised the bar further and further. Now, Doomsday Afternoon is still my favorite album, but I do recognize that number 7 and Snow Torch are probably a better album. So now the bar was so far up there that it was almost unattainable. Now, paired that with this being the conclusion of a 3 album set. And this is where the ante is even higher. You have to follow up such a masterpiece of Doomsday Afternoon. And looking historically at when you have to follow up a masterpiece, things don't go quite according to plan. And so with so much pressure on this album, there's a lot to be met. And so I can understand completely why Phideaux wanted to take the time to make sure that this album met all those expectations. And I'm happy to announce, not only did they meet the expectations, but they rose the bar even higher. They met and exceeded every single one of the expectations that I had for coming into this album. Now, as I mentioned, this album is divided into 4 pieces, 4 sides of an album, and I think right off the bat, this was a brilliant move by Phideaux for structuring the album in this way. By providing the album in 4 succinct chunks of music, it allows for a little bit more of a digestion of such a larger piece. And so we have the first side encompassing the first 4 tracks of Cast Out and Cold, The Error Lives On, Crumble, and Inquisitor. The second side being We Only Have Eyes for You, Sourdome, The Walker, Wake the Sleeper, C99, and Tumbleweed. The third side being The Order of Protection 1, Metro Deathfire, Transit, In Dissonance We Play, The Sleeper's Wake, and The Order of Protection 2, and then finally the last side on here being From Hydrogen to Love, Eternal, and Endgame and End. And so it was very, very well thought out in terms of how each of these movements would interconnect and interplay, because even though they're subdivided into separate songs, each side is its own movement. I want to really praise Phideaux for not dumbing anything down. This is an album that challenges the listener to its benefit. Whenever I'm listening to a lot of music nowadays, I find myself going, oh man, they held back, they dumbed something down, they blunted a blow, they didn't go for it. And this album goes every single time for it. And I kept finding myself sitting there on the first couple of listens going, yes, thank you, yes. They finally decided not to hold back, not to bring things down to make it more accessible, to make it less challenging, but they kept going for a more complex, a more fleshed out, and more realized sound. As I said, it challenges the listener. Phideaux is one that knows the intelligence of his audience and uses that to his benefit. So coming on to some of the particular tracks on this album, as I had mentioned, there are a few callbacks to the previous works. And in this case, it feels like because The Great Leap and Doomsday Afternoon didn't really have a unifying feel between them, this feels like it's the thread that ties the two together. There's a lot of callbacks throughout the movements within this album. And what I love about this is even though it calls back and it uses a lot of the themes and a lot of the roots of those songs, he always flips the expectation of where it goes. And I really, really applaud Phideaux for doing this because it subverts the expectation and it raises the enjoyment level for me of that, because now it's almost harmonizing of what we expected to hear and what we're actually presented with. This is why I come to progressive rock music, because of these interplays of themes. Some people might call it repetitive, but in my mind, it's only repetitive if you do the same thing. This time, it's always doing something new and something different with those themes, and that is what I really love. And on top of this, he doesn't even just shy away from his other past albums in terms of reusing themes and trying different things. We see in Wake the Sleeper, it sounds like a Fortress of Sand from Chupacabras. And similar, the Dormouse theme actually makes an appearance on this album from Sourdome within the third or second act. And that is a really interesting kind of interplay between the two. Now, I know I've gushed quite a bit about this album, and I want to get down into some of the nitty-gritty and actually pull out some of the pieces on this album as well. And first off, the album opens and closes with that same kind of theme that we have on The Error Lives On, as well as the Endgame and End. These two pieces are essentially mirrors of each other, and it opens and closes the albums perfectly, and it wasn't until kind of the third or fourth listen that I realized it was doing this, just because there was so much music to digest. Similarly, I want to call out Crumble on this, because Crumble was found on Doomsday Afternoon, and Crumble was on that album twice, where it goes from this really big instrumental piece where it's vocalizations but without any lyrics. The second one is a little bit more intimate. We have, a little bit of the acoustic sounds and lyrics on there, and now we essentially just have the most intimate point where it's just the lyrics, and that first side really sets the stage of what we had expected. So we have Cast Out and Cold, The Era Lives On, and Crumble, and then we finally have The Inquisitor. And The Inquisitor being the 8 minutes, just beautiful track, providing us with such a bombardment. And this is another thing that I really want to talk about within this album, is how smart each placement of the songs are on this album. We have a lot of very bombarding and very bombastic tunes, such as The Era Lives On and Inquisitor, but it's sandwiched between these very subtle and very intimate moments, such as Crumble. So those 4 tracks, the first 4 tracks, feel like a single track and feel like a single song, even though there's a little bit of a break between Crumble and Inquisitor, which is kind of needed because it's such a large chunk of music. We kind of need a little bit of a breath before we go into such a big track such as Inquisitor.
Those hypnotizing mesmerists, the greedy black ops alchemists, disinformation, it's theirs to share.
Then we come into the second side on the album, which starts off with We Only Have Eyes for You, the track that we've already heard, with the EP, and this goes into some of the really more experimental sides of things. And these 6 tracks really go through quite a bit of ebb and flow, and I really enjoy the C99. C99 has this like really strange note that kind of goes back and forth. It's one of those moments where I'm like, I didn't realize music could do something like that. And having it punctuated so hard, it's almost giving your head like a really big mind screw before we come into such a somber song such as Tumbleweed. And even Tumbleweed grows and grows and grows, and it reminds me of something like Doctrine of Eternal Ice, parts 1 and 2. Now, as I had mentioned before, I really want to talk about the Order of Protection 1 and 2. Phideaux makes you wait. This is where he challenges the listener, and he doesn't insult the listener by kind of subverting their intelligence. We keep hearing tidbits of what it is, and we keep hearing little teases of it before it goes back, and within the sleeper wakes, it feels almost Gentle Giant-y or Van der Graaf generator, where we've got that really strange time signature that keeps coming up, and there's that go and stop, and then we go right into it within the Order of Protection Part 2. And once we get that like really heavy like grounding of this song, and it's such a solid foundation for a song that what's built on top of it just becomes this giant Goliath until it finally crumbles down in the last side, which is From Hydrogen to Love, Eternal, and an Endgame. So this last side, I get teary-eyed for how large it is, and I've seen one review already kind of equate From Hydrogen to Love being like the next big epic, even though it's only about 14 minutes long, equating it to Supper's Ready and Harvest of Souls from IQ. And I will admit, I even heard like there's a little moment and movement within From Hydrogen to Love that sounds very similar to Harvest of Souls, where it's that blah blah, like that note sequence there. This thing is just a Goliath. Like, I thought the Goliath of the Order of Protection Part 2 was so grand and so big that once we get into From Hydrogen to Love, I'm just like, holy jeez, not only did you keep raising the bar, but you kept going. So I'm very glad that the last 2 tracks, Eternal and an Endgame, are a little bit more subdued, that allows us to kind of come down and reflect on what has just transpired, because holy jeez, a lot has transpired since we started this album off. Within From Hydrogen to Love, I could see the reuse of a very similar and simple theme that we've heard before. We heard it on Genesis's The Knife. It's the theme that's from Mars, The Bringer of War, where it's that dun 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 dun. It's not repetitive. because he does something different with that theme, and this is something that recurs a lot within the album, as I already mentioned. So that's why I'm just like, that is just beautiful. So I do want to address some of the criticisms that I can see with this. Now, I don't find these as criticisms, I actually find these more as a advantage of this, but the album can get a little pretentious at times, and because it challenges the intellect, I can see a lot of people not really knowing what to do with this album. There are a few sequences that I feel go on for quite a length, and for me, that's just them exploring the territory, but I can see a lot of people being like, okay, move on, we've already covered this, let's get something new. The other thing that I've already mentioned is that it does feel a little too polished. At times it might feel a little bit too robotic and not really organic enough, but again, I feel like this is a master jigsaw puzzle that's been constructed and placed perfectly and masterfully. And so in that sense, it's kind of hard to really grow things organically, but still there is a number of moments on this that do feel organic and feel very off the cuff, especially those jam sessions within the sleeper movements, such as the sleeper wakes and just the sleeper itself and the wake the sleeper, as well as within the order of protection. And the concept itself is quite large and quite overblown. So if you're not familiar with the Great Leap or Doomsday Afternoon, the lyrics and the concept is going to be kind of lost. At this point, again, I feel like this is Phideaux being like, no, at this point you should know what's going on. I'm not going to do the whole recap thing. I'm just going to give you the final installment of this. One of the reasons why I took so long to really get into and review this album, because I've had this now for over a week, is I was looking for reasons not to give it the rating that I'm about to give it. Because if you guys have been following me, I don't give this rating willy-nilly. Like, I don't just give it off the cuff. I've only really awarded this to 4 albums up to this point, one of them being earlier this year. At the end of the day, after every single listen, I couldn't find a valid reason not to give it this rating. So I'm gonna do it. Infernal by Phideaux is an absolute masterpiece. And much like Phideaux and this album, I realize that this review is a little bit on the longer side, but I also know that if you're fans of Phideaux like me, you're not going to shy away from a 20+ minute album review, because I know I wanted to cover as much as I could with still the limited amount of time that I've had with this album. I feel like this album is going to be one that really matures and really grows with age, and it kept the trend of every album that came from Doomsday Afternoon of being a masterpiece. Like Doomsday Afternoon, Number 7, Snow Torch, all masterpieces, and this one continues the trend. Now I hope that this album, even though it is an end, it's not the end. And I think this is why with Eternal, as well as Endgame, an end, why it isn't the end and simply an end. And I hope that this is essentially the beginning of a new era for Phideaux. So that's about it from me about Eternal from Phideaux. What did you guys think about it? It hasn't come out yet, or depending on when you're watching it, it has come out. So let me know of 2 things. If you haven't heard about it, what are your expectations? What are you hoping to hear from this album? What are you really looking forward to outside of finally hearing this? And also, if you have heard it, what did you love about it? Or what did you not like about it? Did it meet your expectations or did it not? Let me know of all that by commenting down below. Thank you guys so much for watching. You guys, as always, are definitely the best. And until next time, notes out.